Just as the moral and the practical go together, so do the immoral and the impractical. Just as the virtuous is the efficacious, so the evil is the impotent. So begins our reading this week. We're on page 329, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. Today we'll be reading from 329 all the way to 349, Virtue as Practical, is part of the section that we're on right now, and then Happiness as the Normal Condition of Man. And then the last part of this chapter is called Sex as Metaphysical. So we'll be finishing chapter 9 in this book. This book raises the question, is virtue practical? And what is the normal state of man? The normal state. Now, normal is an interesting term, or natural. Within Christianity, we use these terms as well. We would say that there is the natural man. Natural man is in sin. But we would also say that there are some sins that are unnatural. So how are we using those terms? We have to be careful we're not using those terms equivocally. What is man designed to be, I think, is part of what we're looking at when we say what's normal for man. Did God intend for men to be miserable all the time? Or did God have a different plan? Within objectivism, it's what is man? Just what is man, without even bringing God into the question. But we as Christians are going to look at this and bring God into the question and ask, what from this book is true? So Peikoff writes in the middle of this page, evil for objectivism means the willful ignorance or defiance of reality. That has to mean that which cannot deal with reality, that which is whim-ridden, context-dropping, self-contradictory. Evil is consistent in only one regard. Its essence is consistently at war with all the values and virtues human life requires. The idea of being self-contradictory, at war with the requirements of life, that's consistent with the difference between virtue and vice within Christianity. It's also an interesting way of looking at what it means when we say that God is good. Is God at war with the requirements of existence or not? Top of page 330. As with virtue, so with vice, one cannot judge its consequences properly if one takes a short-range viewpoint. The unjust employer, or any other irrationalist, need not reap the whirlwind the day or year he starts on his course. The fountainhead provides an eloquent illustration. If you read the book only halfway through and ask whether Rourke or Keating is the practical man, you may well be tempted to decide in favor of Keating. At that point, Rourke is friendless, unrecognized, condemned to work in a quarry, while Keating is at the top of his profession and surrounded by admirers. But if you continue reading and grasp the logic of the subsequent events, the principles dictating the outcome, you know why Rourke ultimately wins out and why Keating has to fail. The same principles apply to every case of the apparent efficacy of evil. Andrew, you raised a point from Scripture in your reading even just this week that echoes this idea of the long range versus the short range when you look at what is the state of man and whether you can be happy short range. Do you want to share the passages that you were thinking of?
You and I have talked about before, 2 Timothy 3, that says, in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, and we've talked about that, and lovers of money, proud, arrogant. Goes on for several verses talking about the sins of these people. And it ends up by saying, but they will not get very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those two men, Jannes and Jambres. There's a picture of Paul encouraging Timothy, who is a pastor in a church that's facing persecution, saying, hey, there's going to be all these people who are persecuting you, and it's going to look like you are losing. I mean, this is really a lot of the model of most of the New Testament, Revelation especially. You're being trampled, you're suffering, but those people will be crushed eventually. And that goes right in line with what is being said here, that they need not reap the whirlwind immediately. And Scripture is clear about that evil prospers for a while. You think about the wheat and the tares. The tares will grow up among the wheat, and they will look like they're thriving for a long time, and will even persecute the good grain for a long time. But in the end, their folly will be known to all. They will be destroyed. The long-range success or failure is still the metric. It's very clear in the New Testament that that's the case.
Thanks for that. One passage that came to my mind is in 1 Peter chapter 4. He says, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though some strange thing were happening to you, but rejoice in as much as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. Peter seems to think that suffering is normal for Christians. During the age of the church, there will be persecutions. People who follow Jesus are going to be treated the way that Jesus was treated sometimes, and you should expect that will happen sometimes. And so he says, it's good that you're not suffering as a thief, you're suffering as a Christian. Don't be ashamed of the fact that you're suffering. Don't be ashamed that you bear the name of Christian. It's time for judgment to begin with God's household, and it begins with us. What will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel of God? He goes on and talks about how you commit yourself to your Creator and you continue to do good. and you trust that there's going to be judgment in the end. That's one of the main themes of Christianity, is that things are going to be reversed, things are going to be made right, and it's over the long term. You compare that with, what we have today. If you were to just think about, what does common sense tell us? Common sense tells us that sometimes people get away with it for a while. So this is not a controversial point within Christianity or within objectivism. People can get away with evil for a while, but we also have common sense sayings like cheaters never prosper or lying doesn't pay, those kinds of things. Well, they never prospered long range. That's the point. We read on in this material, an inverted moral code has so corrupted people that they associate evil with value rather than loss. So one of the themes that we have in our political discourse today is this idea of the robber barons, or those greedy capitalists, the exploiters. And so that's a theme that if you're trying to discuss politics with people, you need to be aware that people do have this idea that people can cheat and they can hurt people short range and that they may get away with it. And so I would say that in our political discussions, we should point out to people, yeah, that's true. Don't try to downplay that point. Because what we're advocating when we advocate for liberty, individual rights, and capitalism is that those who earn and own ought to keep. Now, if somebody didn't earn it, if somebody doesn't own it, they don't need to keep it. If you're in a discussion with somebody who believes there are exploiters, just acknowledge it. We also think there are exploiters. And there's actually some common ground that we might have with some of the points that leftists make about criticisms of today's society. We don't believe that all rich people are robber barons or exploiters. And that's the point that we're trying to make here. It's not true that just because somebody has money, that therefore they got it in a corrupt way. Go to the next section here. Men, as Dominique Franchon thinks in The Fountainhead, had been so mistaken about the shapes of the devil. He was not single and big. He was many and smutty and small. We have this sort of cultural myth of the big, bad, evil guy. Either he's a robber baron, or he's Jeff Bezos, or Mark Zuckerberg, or whoever. And we think, oh yeah, they're so powerful. The corruption in our society is not mainly coming from one rich man, or something like that. The corruption in our society comes from the many and the small who do immoral things on a case-by-case basis. You can see an interesting point from We the Living. It's not an army of heroes or even of fiends, but of shriveled bookkeepers with a rupture who have learned to be arrogant. Kind of reminds me of our medical system or our education system, or the system in our country of adoption and foster care. There's just many people that make small decisions that hurt people. That's the kind of world that we live in. It's not necessarily a world where there's this one huge, big, bad dude. Not to say that there aren't some of those as well. The point that Peikoff wants to make here is that long range, you can only become so powerful and so evil. Because eventually evil is self-contradictory. Evil, he writes, does have one power. It is not the power to create, to set positive goals and to achieve them, but the power to destroy itself and its victims. So you don't see evil empires lasting for thousands upon thousands of years. Evil empires destroy themselves. Evil companies destroy themselves. Evil people destroy themselves. Because they're parasites. They are self-contradictory. They're not principled. Everything that we've just understood from the chapter on virtue is lacking there in some way. In some way, it's undercut. Why is this so useful for us to understand? Well, it gives us hope, and also it's going to give us some knowledge about strategy. So let's read on. Whenever a human value is involved, its achievement requires the use of the mind. Its destruction requires the opposite. And if you skip ahead, Peikoff writes, to create the United States required the intellect and the painstaking debates of the founding fathers. To run it into the ground, only a crew of anti-intellectuals, only the crew that is now ensconced in Washington. He wrote this in 1991 or so. It hasn't changed. Ayn Rand writes, no thought, knowledge, or consistency is required in order to destroy. Unremitting thought, enormous knowledge, and a ruthless consistency are required in order to achieve or create. So you have to understand this about the nature of what evil is. This will give us a strategy for how we have to fight it. In a proper society, evil is a marginal element. When men live by rational principles, the evil, so far as men can identify its presence, is ostracized and stopped. Under these conditions, even its power to destroy is largely nullified, except in regard to the evildoer himself. This is an amazing point. I mean, you could read over it and gloss over it, but there are different kinds of societies where there is more evil or less evil. And there is such thing as a proper society, a society that penalizes evil and that therefore reduces it. Shouldn't be a revolutionary idea, but you talk to Christians today and they almost act like they don't believe it.
I know that we keep coming back to Proverbs. Someone made a great point. Everything about Proverbs points to the necessity of a free society, and two main points that are distinct. One is the instruction to search for truth and to search for wisdom presupposes a free society where you can use your mind. You couldn't encourage someone to seek wisdom and go get insight in communist China for many reasons. But secondly, Proverbs portrays evil as coming to a quick, swift end. And so those two things are combined. The freedom that is necessary to use one's mind and to seek knowledge and to apply knowledge consistently is also the same exact kind of society where evil is, like it says, ostracized, shunned, and swept aside, and nobody regards it.
One way to think about the role of the government in society is imagine your house if you were to sweep it once every year. How dirty would your house become? Versus if you were to sweep it every week, or if you were to sweep it every other day, if you have kids in the house and there's food on the floor all the time. You can never get rid of every bit of dirt in your house. You can maintain a livable situation for most people most of the time with a proper government. That's what Peikoff is describing here, is keeping evil to a minimum and then coming in and cleaning it up when necessary. Peikoff probably look at the way that societies have been throughout history, and he would say there's been very few societies that did a great job of that, but there's also been almost no societies that were the exact opposite of that. A society where there's just no order at all. Most societies have been a mix of people understanding what the government's for, but also, to some degree, taking the government and doing things that it shouldn't do. There's been throughout history a partnership between the people that wanted to just not be virtuous, to usurp power for themselves, the wicked, a partnership between them and the capitulating good. Those who don't want injustices to take place, they don't want force to be initiated, but they have compromised with those evil people. And it's that compromise, it allows the evil to live parasitically on the good. And so this is the strategy point that I've been trying to make. Once you understand the nature of evil, you understand evil cannot survive by itself. Good can. Typically throughout history, what we've seen is this combination of the evil and the good together, with the evil being parasitical. So Peikoff writes, unfortunately, men have not dominantly lived by rational principles. One way or another throughout the centuries, the men who embody the good, or who represent it in a given issue, have aided, not stopped the evil. So he calls these people the road pavers. They paved the road for the tyrants, even though they were not tyrants themselves. And this is very often us as conservatives. So this means this is good news for us to identify this fact, because it means we have agency here and we can make changes. In the medieval times, the serfs were paving the way for the tyrants. They worked to feed the tyrants, even though they didn't necessarily have any idea how they could get out of that problem. He talks about anybody who agreed to carry on his back a gang of loafing relatives. So if you don't follow Paul's advice, anyone that will not work, he shall not eat, well then you are being that good person that's a capitulator and a compromiser. Does this not bring to mind some parallels about what happens within religious groups? The way there are leftists who want to take over Christian seminaries, for example, and then there are the strong conservatives. But for the most part, the seminaries' leadership is composed of people that are in the middle. They're the capitulators. They're the road pavers. We'd call them the institutionalists. They want to preserve the institution. They want to preserve the peace. But what they end up doing is tying together the liberals and the conservatives and letting the liberals feed off the conservatives' funds like parasites. That's exactly what's going on in religious institutions throughout our country right now. This is one other application besides politics, is the life of our institutions. The good fails to recognize that it is good and that it must be protected from the evil. It fails to identify the facts. Top of 333, throughout history, the good has failed to recognize itself or to assert its rightful claims. In the ethics that has so far ruled the world, the transfusion of value from the deserving to the undeserving is regarded as the essence of virtue. The virtuous man, by definition, must work to bring about the success of parasites. This theory is the formal demand for the arming of evil. In Ayn Rand's historic identification, it is the demand for the sanction of the victim. Now, if you understand this concept of sanction of the victim, sanction means giving someone moral permission to live, saying, I approve of you in some way. This is key. This is key to understanding why so many of us that were in the Southern Baptist Convention have said, we're not going to support that. We're not going to ever donate any money to the Southern Baptist Convention ever again. The moral man's approval of his own martyrdom is what the sanction of the victim means. It means man's willingness to embrace his exploiters and to pay them ransom for his virtues. So would you ever, if you were a Christian and a conservative, go into a partnership with people that are going around saying that if you're white, you're racist? Of course not. It's incompatible with what Christianity teaches. Why would I consider joining such men in a partnership? Okay, well then if you already found yourself in a partnership, why would you not be doing everything you can to get out of that partnership? Like the Proverbs often talks about, if you've put up security for somebody, free yourself, drop everything and free yourself from this commitment. Why would you want to be bound to somebody else? This is a problem within the Southern Baptist Convention, is people don't look at what people actually are. Who are these preachers? What are they saying? Are they saying, for example, that God whispers about sexual sin? If they want to say that, it's not just a problem of what's our strategy for evangelizing the world. It's a problem with what are you evangelizing the world to believe? Why would you partner with somebody who's teaching people the opposite of what's true? So many people want to be in the middle. They want to be compromisers. They want to say, let's unify. Why? Why would we unify with people who aren't Christians? So this is the moral issue in John Galt's strike, which is in Atlas Shrugged. To say no to this code for the first time, Galt refuses to sanction the immolation of the creators. He withdraws the power of the good from the hands of the evil. He quits the world and lets the evil confront the full reality of its own impotence. When you understand the impotence of evil, you will be motivated also to do the kind of thing like we talk about, going Galt. Saying no to evil, I'm not going to partner with you, not going to help you. I'm going to be separate from you. I think that it is important to be willing, in whatever sphere of activity you're in, to know what is your standard for separation. Doesn't mean you have to separate all the time, but you have to know what would cause you to want to separate. If you cannot identify that line, if you're one of these people that says, I'm going to save the Southern Baptist Convention, or I'm going to save the Republican Party, or whatever it is, well, what is the criteria by which you would decide that that's no longer going to be your course of action? And they say, I'm going down with the ship. Well, that's a problem. There needs to be some criteria. I mean, to the people that want to save the Southern Baptist Convention, I say, why aren't you trying to save the Roman Catholic Church? There has to be some kind of basis for it. Okay, top of 334. Leonard Peikoff does this sometimes. He writes in a way that seems to be unwinding his premises, and so you get to the very end and you realize this is his hierarchically first point. And so I'm actually going to read these couple of pages in a little bit of a reverse order, an order that makes a little more sense to me as far as understanding his overall point. So at the top of 334, why have men for centuries been content to live with so insufferable a contradiction as the moral-practical dichotomy? Why have they not indignantly rejected the conventional ethics precisely because it is impractical? The answer points us to the roots of ethics in metaphysics and in epistemology. So he's going to bring in his theory of concepts. He's going to say that if you had a theory of concepts that doesn't map observations to concepts and that doesn't have a sense of certainty about how to do that, then you're going to have a lack of certainty about ethical questions. If you skip to the bottom of 335, morality, Ayn Rand says, is practical because consciousness is practical. And consciousness is practical because it is the faculty of perceiving that which exists. So we know from Rand's theory of consciousness that consciousness is efficacious and that we can have concepts. We can have certainty about our concepts. And morality, in her view, is just a matter of conceptualizing those things that support man's life in principle long range. So there's no mystery about why morality would be successful as an idea. You skip back a couple paragraphs. As long as men reject reason in epistemology, they will necessarily reject it in ethics. You can see the connection there. If we can't know anything, then of course we can't know right and wrong. Peikoff writes, if they introduce a breach between consciousness and existence at the base of their thinking, they will carry that breach into their thinking on value questions as well. Such an approach will lead them inevitably to some form of the moral-practical dichotomy. Go back to the bottom of 334. Principles are a form of conceptualization. Pitting principles against life is equivalent to pitting theory against practice. In both formulations, one is pitting concepts against life and practice, which means one is accepting a breach between concepts and reality. This in turn presupposes a certain view of concepts. And then he talks about how there's nothing but a false theory of concepts that could lead you to this, to detach your observations from your concepts. So then lastly, we're going to skip back a paragraph. He says, so these people, they agree that morality by its nature is harmful. It is harmful in regard to this life, says the one. It is harmful in real life, says the other. Life accordingly requires not virtue in any definition, but expediency. In other words, principles to guide one's choices are not a necessity of successful action here on earth. Rather, they are an otherworldly impediment, a spiritual thorn in one's flesh to be masochistically endured and amorally plucked out. The consequence of separating your concepts from your morality are that you will end up thinking that you must either have morality that doesn't work or immorality that does work. So that's his point there. Bottom of 335, in contrast to all of that, in contrast to this theory that sets up the moral versus the practical, Peikoff believes that happiness is the normal condition of man. Now, if you compare this idea to the Bible, I would say, well, yes and no. And even if you were to just compare it to your observations of your own life and other people's lives, yes and no. I mean, as long as we live in a world where there is death and sin, there's going to be a limit on the amount of happiness that we can have. And I think that even the objectivists would understand that as long as we live in the world that we live in today, it's difficult to be happy. It's difficult not to be cynical in some ways. The normal condition, or say the natural condition, does this mean that there's something wrong with you if you're not happy right now? Or does it mean that there's something wrong with your society if it's difficult to be happy right now? It means that your happiness detector, your value detector, is functioning correctly. If you find yourself placed in hot water and you sense that it's hot water, your value detector is operating correctly. There is a problem with our lives right now. There really is. There is a problem with our society. I can agree with Peikoff that happiness is the normal for human beings. And then the additional point that I'd like to make is we don't find ourselves in a normal situation here. We were not created for the situation that we are finding ourselves in. That could be an apologetic angle that we could use as we discuss the existence of God with objectivists. Do you sense that we were built to live in a world like this? That this is what we were made for? On the physical level, Ayn Rand observes, a pleasure-pain mechanism is a barometer of one's basic alternative, life or death. Just as the body has a pleasure-pain sensation to protect it, so consciousness has two emotions, joy and suffering. As a barometer of the same alternative, life or death, joy is the result of gaining a chosen value, when held on the conceptual level, as against an innate physiologically set value. Suffering is the result of loss or failure on this level. This brings us to happiness, the topic of happiness. What is happiness? And it is a fundamental and enduring form of joy. So according to objectivism, joy is the basic idea, and happiness is when you have joy, long range, enduring, fundamentally. Happiness is the state of consciousness which proceeds from the achievement of one's values. Only the moral man, as we know, the exponent of self-preservation, uses his conceptual faculty to make the countless decisions involved in choosing values and pursuing goals. Only he selects ends and means, consonant with the nature of existence and with the integrity of his own consciousness. So Peikoff concludes only he is really the practical man. Only he is able to achieve values. Only he, therefore, can reach the emotional result and the reward of such an achievement. There's something about being a moral person, being a person that is rational, being a person that is principled, that leads you to being able to succeed in this overall project of your life, which is to find happiness. This, in our culture, doesn't come across as particularly controversial, but I think that it's good that we have the philosophical grounding for it. The moral, the practical, and the happy cannot be sundered. By their nature, the three form a unity. So that's the controversial point, is that being moral, being practical, and being happy, they all come together. He who perceives reality is able to gain his ends and thus enjoy the process of being alive. Similarly, the evil, the impractical, and the unhappy form a unity. That's even more controversial because, I mean, in our society, don't you see sort of the narrative of, oh yeah, you could be a thief and you could be happy. You could rip other people off and you could ignore standards of right and wrong behavior, but you could totally live the high life. We see that narrative. But Peikoff says that it's impractical and it's immoral and it's going to result in a lack of happiness. So Peikoff writes, he who evades renders himself impotent in action and thus experiences life as suffering. There's a lot we could say about that, but I think that what he's describing is consistent with the way Christianity sees the world as well. So we go to top of 338. Happiness, writes Ayn Rand, is an important elaboration. She says it is a state of non-contradictory joy, a joy without penalty or guilt, a joy that does not clash with any of your values and does not work for your own destruction, not the joy of escaping from your mind, but of using your mind's fullest power, not the joy of faking reality, but of achieving values that are real, not the joy of a drunkard, but of a producer. So this is one way that you can ask yourself, are you achieving happiness in your life? Is your happiness getting away from work for a weekend and playing video games? That's your entire definition of happiness. Or is it getting drunk on a Friday night or something like that? If that's your means of achieving happiness, what does the Bible say about that? Well, that's not for princes. That's not for kings. That's for people who are suffering. That's for people who have no hope. That's the best happiness that they can achieve. That's what it says in the Proverbs. Happiness should not be an escape from reality. It should be an engagement with reality, at least for the most part. Not to say we don't need vacations, or not to say we should never drink alcohol or play a video game. But the point is, there is a positive orientation toward this life and what is valuable in this life.
I think it's important here to stress that regardless of your precise views on eschatology and things like that, the Christian's hope is heaven, but it's that God's will would be done and his kingdom would come on earth as it is in heaven, so that this world would be renewed and remade. Paul in Romans 8 talks about that all of creation groans and is eagerly awaiting the revealing of the sons of God. It's evil that's temporary. It's evil that is the aberration. I think it's important to read these chapters in Opar and let it remind us that happiness is to be fully enjoyed in an embodied state in a physical earthly world, even though it's a heavenly earth.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that is an interesting idea. There is a controversy within Christian theologians about the end times, but what we can agree on is that the scripture does describe there being a kingdom of heaven on earth in some way. So what is that? That's what the theologians can disagree about. But what we shouldn't disagree about is that point that you just made, Andrew. We are intended to live embodied lives. And so any approach to morality that separates the practical from the moral, for that reason, it's inconsistent with Christianity. If you were to come to one conclusion or the other about the eschatological position, you shouldn't conclude, therefore, morality is impractical or that life on earth is doomed to suffering all the time. A look at history would tell you that there are cycles in human history. I've read about the question of whether or not the world is getting better or worse over time. And it's sort of a mixed question because the population of the earth is so much more than it's ever been. I mean, there's probably more murders taking place in the last 20 years than took place in the 20 years before that, just because there's more people. But if you were to look at it over time, the percentage of the population that is living in poverty is significantly decreasing, even though we live in a time of recession and war in the last several years. Even now, the amount of people that are thriving in the world is more than any other time in history. And the percentage is probably better than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. There are things about the civilization that are changing. There are things about life in the United States that have become not as amazing as in the past. But in terms of people's health and in terms of people's wealth, those things have increased significantly. It's possible for the world to get better or worse. And with that knowledge, we realize that we need principles to seek the good. And in some cases, like the American Founding Fathers, to establish new governments, to establish justice in the world. That kind of pursuit is actually valuable, even if it's only going to last for 20 years or 100 years. Even if you only, as an attorney, can win justice for one person. To that extent, it's valuable. So we go to the next section, 338. Love in this context. Rand is talking about being motivated by love rather than being motivated by fear. So love in this context means the desire to gain and enjoy a value. Fear means the desire to escape a disvalue. And the distinction pertains to man's primary motive in a given undertaking. So should we be primarily motivated by a positive or a negative? This is an issue. They would dismiss the person that's primarily motivated by fear or by avoiding negatives as being second-handed, not as heroic of a person as they should be. They mention an example of the presidential candidate that clearly just wants to not lose. He's not really motivated by convincing people that he's right in his vision, but he just wants to not make any mistakes. A quote from Rand, "Achieving life is not the equivalent of avoiding death. Joy is not the absence of pain. Intelligence is not the absence of stupidity. Light is not the absence of darkness. An entity is not the absence of non-entity." That's interesting. She has Galt saying that in his speech. And I think Jacob Brenton was right when he pointed it out. This is a direct contradiction to some of the things that Peikoff had said earlier about how avoiding death is the only criterion for value. It can't be, because achieving life is not the equivalent of avoiding death. Achieving life is the criterion for value, not avoiding death. I was glad that Jacob pointed that out. Bottom of this page, self-preservation and happiness are not separate issues. There is an integration between those two. They are one indivisible fact looked at from two aspects, from the internal and external. Peikoff writes, "Virtue does ensure happiness in a certain sense, just as it ensures practicality." If you remember from last week, we discussed how, in principle, if you're defining practical actions in principle, what kinds of actions are practical? then you can say that virtue is practical. In the same way here, he says, if you're looking at what kinds of things lead to happiness in the general sense, virtue does ensure happiness in a certain sense in the general sense. In existential terms, a man may not have achieved his values, like Howard Rourke if it's early on in his career, or if there are things outside of his control, like Kira in We the Living. Did Kira achieve her happiness? Well, she became the kind of person with the kind of character that's always seeking the happiness by the most practical and virtuous means. And so, in a sense, whether or not they succeed, Rand can say that this person is a hero. This person is confident, at peace with himself, serene, a happy person. And the pain only goes down so deep, because what they're motivated by is what they love, not what they hate or fear. So they may not achieve success, but their ability to succeed is intact. It's just there are accidental circumstances outside of their control, but they do have the right relationship to reality, and they know that they are able to live. Rourke or Kira or anybody else that's going through a hard time is able to live because they have the character that is suitable for living. And in that, Peikoff describes them having metaphysical pleasure. That is, joy in the immediate experience of living, knowing that I am the kind of person that is capable of living. Metaphysical pleasure, even if other things aren't going their way. Let's go to the top of 341. There is no joy in being alive if one cannot live. So contrast Kira's character to Leo in We the Living, if you're familiar with that Ayn Rand novel. He's a picture of somebody who senses that he cannot live. And so his metaphysical joy is taken away from him, and he becomes self-destructive. There's another character, Andre, that has the same predicament, and he also becomes self-destructive. So virtue does ensure happiness, at least in the metaphysical sense, except when life itself becomes impossible to a man because for some reason the pursuit of values becomes impossible. And the most obvious example would be in a dictatorship, and that's why in We the Living, Kira seeks to escape and try to get abroad out of Russia. Now, we compare that with the Christian point of view. There are situations which are pretty unlivable and which you have to try to get out. But that, as a Christian, ought never to justify you taking your own life or getting into a situation where you just drink yourself into oblivion. We could never justify those things because we have a much stronger source of hope. Christianity would qualify this slightly. He contrasts the approach to happiness that he has versus the intrinsicist or subjectivist ideas. The intrinsicists, he says, are typically going to have a high suspicion against anything that's selfish, ambitious, materialist, because they think that values are from a different world. And so enjoying your life right now is suspicious. The intrinsicists, like the arch example of that might be the monastic life. Peikoff writes, to an objectivist, the adoration of pain is literally unspeakable. Morally, there's nothing to say about it beyond noting that its cause is the worship of death. You can see how the monastics worshipped death in some ways. For example, there was a person who lived his whole life in a monastery because he was adopted and he never saw a woman. So he never had that joy of having a romantic relationship his whole life. That limiting of men, it goes against the Bible, doesn't it? It goes against the directions for elders. That's their standard. And I mean, I can see why to some extent it's easy for Christians in history to have been confused about the issue because they mixed Platonism with Christianity. And Christianity itself has as its main hero somebody who died on a cross, and that's our symbol. But you can see the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism by when they have crosses in their churches, whether there is still Jesus on that cross versus whether Jesus is now off the cross. You want the whole story, as it says in Hebrews 12:2. Jesus endured the suffering, but he despised it, and it was for the sake of the joy that was set before him. And now he's exalted. He's not on that cross still. Contrast that whole approach with what has historically been the main competitor to the intrinsicist doctrine, and that's subjectivism, hedonism. If you're familiar with the term Christian hedonism, we're not talking about that. Regular old hedonism, pleasure or happiness is the standard of value. Rand's view is that life is the standard of value, man's life, and that pleasure and happiness are the purpose. She distinguishes those two, the standard versus the purpose. Hedonism simply makes this error of not differentiating. And so whatever makes you feel good becomes whatever you should do, which equates to I'm going to do whatever I feel like doing, and I'm going to call that good, which is not logical. So Rand points out, here's the issue, and Peikoff points out, the emotion of pleasure is a consequence of your value judgments. If you were to embrace hedonism, you'd be embracing a circular theory. It amounts to value what you value. Value what you already value. Do what you feel like doing. This is why we have to distinguish here and say that happiness is properly the purpose of ethics, but it is not the standard of ethics. Going to the next page. This is 342. Rand, by contrast, advocating as she does an objective approach to ethics, holds that pleasure is moral. Happiness, therefore, is not only possible, but more, it is the normal condition of man. Ayn Rand calls this conclusion, which is essential to the objectivist worldview, the benevolent universe premise. In this connection, I would point out there is a film by Terrence Malick, and I think it's called A Hidden Life, or is it A Hidden Life?
Yeah, A Hidden Life. I think I watched that because you recommended it.
Yes. That film shows a man that's living in the Alps in Austria during the time of the rise of the Nazis. And he lives on a farm, and he just wants to live his life normally. But he gets conscripted in the Nazi army, I guess it's the Wehrmacht or something like that. And he refuses to fight. And so they kick him out, and then eventually the political establishment comes for him. And the religious establishment won't support him. His own townspeople won't support him. He goes through this crisis with his family because of his moral position. It's a very spiritual film, and it's not really about Nazism. It's really about what kind of man do you want to be. As this man goes through suffering, he never loses his value orientation, and he never loses his conviction that he wants to be a moral man. As I think about this benevolent universe premise, the benevolent universe premise is not saying that you'll never find yourself living in that situation. Through the course of your life, from crisis to crisis, whatever ends up happening, you can have joy and happiness in being the kind of person that you want to be, that you value being, the kind of person that you identify as being virtuous. You can have the kind of life that is worth living up until the point that you can't anymore. Rand's view of objectivism, this value-oriented approach, this benevolent universe approach, is consistent with a film like that. Because that film just paints the value so high. The value of just being married. There's scenes where they're just sitting in a field, just talking, and you can sense that they love each other. They have made a choice about what kind of people they want to be, and they respect each other, they respect themselves, and that their life there, for that moment, is all that they want. I bring that up because this could be fuel for you if you ever check out that movie. This could be fuel for you to see what kind of life you want to live, and part of it is being willing to experience joy right now. It's not always easy to experience joy in the moment, to be open to experiencing it. This is what's in that film. And I think it's because the person has accepted this idea that joy is normal. It's the way life ought to be, and it's the way it can be when you choose for it to be. So this benevolent universe premise, it's the idea that the universe is auspicious to human life, not that there will never be any suffering or tyranny. The universe is the kind of place where joy can be obtained. Pickoff writes, for the moral man, failures, though possible, are an exception to the rule. The rule is success. The state of consciousness, to be fought for and to be accepted, is happiness. So now we can compare some of this to objectivism. Christianity would say yes and no about whether we can expect happiness in this life right now, because we also know that we should be expecting persecution. Christianity teaches that we ought to be seeking to be joyful, that we ought to reject bitterness or worry. Christianity teaches that we ought to embrace as a virtue gratitude toward God. And so there are some things that Christians would add to this picture that the objectivists don't know about. Gratitude toward God, for example. In general, Christianity agrees with this approach that we ought to be value-oriented. Values can be achieved, whether it's short-term or long-term. The Bible speaks very highly of hope as a virtue. The hero, in Rand's view, refuses to take pain seriously. He refuses to grant it metaphysical significance. To him, pleasure is a revelation of reality, a reality where life is possible, but pain is merely a stimulus to corrective action and to the question that such an action presupposes. So the question is not what's the use, but what can I do? Rand has a view of heroes that are efficacious, that have agency, that have volition. We see from Rand a quote, we do not think that tragedy is our natural fate, and we do not live in a chronic dread of disaster. It is not happiness, but suffering that we consider unnatural. And so, as I mentioned before, natural, it could have various meanings, but the normal state of things, the state to be sought, the state that we believe is achievable. Now, we read, the man who refuses to blame his problems on reality, therefore keeps alive his only means of solving them. You can accept that there are things that you can do in the future to change your circumstances. If you do that, then you have agency. If you refuse to do that, then you've basically said, it's reality's fault. I live in a malevolent universe. But then if you say that, then you've shut down your potential for different actions. That's a summary of Rand's thought on this issue, how you accept agency and how you seek your joy and how you believe that you live in a benevolent universe. I think all of this is consistent with Christianity. This isn't something as a Protestant Christian that I have any problem understanding. I do see that some other branches of Christianity, especially Roman Catholicism, might have a problem with this. I'm not sure. There's lots of varieties of views within any religious organization. If Rand is critiquing Christianity, to the extent that she's aiming to critique it, I agree with her critiques. Any interactions on that material before we go to this next topic?
I just think that this is a great explanation that Christians can take hold of hope. You know that really cringy quote by Joel Osteen where he says, "Don't let the facts get in the way of your faith," or something like that. That's probably what he's very crudely trying to get to. This description here is even stronger for us because we know that the benevolent universe, that there actually is a God who loves us, and there's a God who is love, and that makes this whole passage even stronger for us. The world is a place where good is achievable and good is more real than evil, is something that we can all look to truly no matter what the circumstances are. I mentioned 1 Peter earlier. He says, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him." You're not bound by the concrete things you perceive in the moment. "Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls." And I think that's an idea that it's good to have it put into philosophical terms for us because we need to be reminded of it when we might be just in a mundane situation.
I appreciate all that. You reminded me of this topic of how can there be a God and how can there be evil? They call it a theodicy or defense for how there can be a God that allows evil. If God is all powerful and if God is all good, then why evil? They call it the problem of evil. Reminds me of Augustine's approach to solving this issue is understanding that evil is privation. Evil is where God's good hand withholding and sustaining is taken away. And so to the extent that he takes away his hand, things can fall into destruction and chaos. But you understand evil as privation, therefore it's not there's these two forces, the benevolent and the malevolent forces in the universe. Rather, there's one force, the force is goodness. And then there's to some extent when an entity has been deprived of goodness, then it begins to die or become corrupted. That whole question is going to be easier to understand if you understand what Rand has said in this section about being oriented toward the good and believing that there is a benevolent universe. The categories that she brings into there are going to be really useful as you look at the problem of evil, because you realize that evil is, as Rand had pointed out, small, not large. This concept of evil as privation, you can tie that with God as an egoist God. I won't say a lot about that, but you can see it at christianintellectual.com. We have several videos about God as an egoist connecting to those themes. 343. So this is several pages on the philosophy of sex. It says, sex as metaphysical. A rational man needs not merely to know intellectually that he is good and the universe auspicious, but to experience that in the form of a consummate emotion, the full reality of these two facts which are essential to his action and survival. They have a theory on sex. There are going to be things about this that I agree with and things that I disagree with. And there are going to be things where I think that they get Christianity wrong, but we'll see. To quote Ayn Rand, sex is a celebration of oneself and one's existence. It is a celebration of one's power to gain values and of the world in which one gains them. I would agree. You have to have a sense of self-worth, ability to live in order to enjoy an experience of sex. It's an experience of self-expression. So sex, therefore, is a form of feeling happiness, but from a special perspective. Sex is the rapture of experiencing emotionally two interconnected achievements, self-esteem and the benevolent universe conviction. That's true psychologically. If you just think about what sex is, it is an expression of joy. And so the person who is incapable of feeling joy, or the person who has just received terrible news, has no interest in sex. Sex is a unique form of answering the supreme question of evolutional being, can I live? Now, it's interesting. This psychological premise behind sex of can I live? Am I the kind of person that is capable of living in the earth? Is the same action that is connected to reproduction, which is you create another living being. So it's no surprise that those two things are connected. The people that believe that they're capable of living are going to naturally take actions that lead to more living beings. That's interesting. It has survival utility, doesn't it? Sex is a physical capacity in the service of a spiritual need. It reflects not man's body alone nor his mind alone, but their integration. And I agree. And that's something that Christianity does a great job of, at least not all variants of Christianity, but within mainstream Christianity today, there is actually a broad consensus about this issue, that sex is good, that it's for a man and a woman who are married, and that it is something that is not just physical pleasure, but that it is the connection of your spirit to the other person as well as your body. These are topics that Christians have right, and that honestly, most other people in the world have wrong. So we read, all animal needs and pleasures are transfigured in the context of the rational animal. Human beings, precisely to the extent that they have attained human stature, gain comparatively little enjoyment from the mere sensation of satisfying these needs. Their pleasure comes mostly from the accompanying emotions. So you compare it to eating a meal or any other joy in life. It is the spiritual component is just as important as the physical. Top of the next page. So a pleasure that was once purely biological becomes, in the life of a conceptual being, largely spiritual. The principle applies preeminently to sex. No human pleasure as intense as that of sex can be dominantly a matter of physical sensation. Dominantly, sex is an emotion, and the cause of the emotion is intellectual. Not a point that I've heard before, that sex has an intellectual cause. But by intellectual, I think we mean the thoughts of a person about their own life and their own values, and about the other person. The bottom of this page, romantic love is the strongest positive emotion possible between two individuals. Its experience, therefore, so far from being an animal reaction, is a self-revelation. The values giving rise to this kind of response must be the most intensely held and personal. And that's one of the reasons why sex needs to be reserved and not promiscuous. It needs to be for a man and woman who are married. Well, that's one of the reasons why promiscuity is to be avoided. I mean, comparing this to Christianity, yeah, we agree with the points here. But now, there's a point here that I'm going to disagree with. It says, when a man and woman do fall in love, assuming that each is romantically free and the context otherwise appropriate, sex is a necessary and proper expression of their feelings for each other. Within Objectivism, sex outside of marriage is morally okay, as long as they love each other. And that's not what Christianity teaches. Christianity holds sex as being more valuable, more special and unique than that. There's practical reasons, obviously. You don't want there to be children outside of marriage. If they could be born into marriage, it's much better. There's also the spiritual reason, the damage that it does to a person when they reveal themselves to the fullest, when there's every part of them is revealed to the other person. That creates a connection. And if you separate that, that creates wounds. And so Christianity has an approach to sex that values people and that takes care of them better than the objectivist position does. Sex is the preeminent form of bringing love into physical reality, Peikoff writes. Now, he says it's a complex subject, and it's mostly a subject for psychology, or in the case of a Christian, it's a subject for your religion as well. He says, okay, so what does philosophy say about it? And Ayn Rand says, it says that sex is good. And I think that that's about as much as you need to say philosophically, because we're talking about the relationship of man to the universe. Imagine what it would mean philosophically to say that sex is not important or that it's bad. Well, it's like, first of all, it's necessary for procreation, so it has to be good. It's also a cause of joy. It's a way of expressing yourself only in the context of a relationship with the person that you love the most. And so to that extent, of course it's good. You'd have to say philosophically. And to say that it's evil, that would be like saying enjoying life is evil or something like that. So of course we reject that. So Peikoff writes, sex is moral. It is an exalted pleasure. It is a profound value. Like happiness, therefore, sex is an end in itself. It is not necessarily means to any further end such as procreation. So philosophically, they take this position that it would be morally acceptable to have sex with your spouse, or in this case, they would broaden it to somebody you're in love with. But they would say that it's acceptable even if you're not planning or intending to reproduce. There are Christians in the conservative groups within Christianity that would say that you should only have sex if you are doing it in order to have kids. And so any form of intentionally not conceiving, any form at all, is immoral. That's not the mainstream Christian view, and I wouldn't agree with those people. But you can find them within Protestantism, within Catholicism, those that say that any kind of effort to avoid pregnancy while experiencing sex is, by its definition, immoral. It's just, I don't see the basis for that in Scripture. I don't see the basis for it philosophically. So I agree with the objectivists on that point. The guiding principle in sex should be esteem sex as an expression of reason and of man's life in the full moral sense of the term. Then, keeping this context in mind, pursue the value greedily. Should you want it, and should you want it without a sense of guilt? Yes. Now, Christians have a reputation for not believing that, but actually, according to the Bible, according to the book of Proverbs, sex is a great value. And if you look at the Puritans, they are a good example of people that have been misunderstood historically. Their name etymologically sounds like, oh, they believe in purity, which means they believe in we shouldn't have sex or something like that, which is a complete historical misunderstanding. The Puritans wanted to get the influence of the Catholic Church out of the Church of England. And then they moved to the United States to seek religious liberty. And the Puritans that lived in the United States, they were unabashed about the value of sex. So if you could look into that, you could realize, oh, the term Puritan doesn't mean that they were against sex or joy or things like that. So that's just something to think about, is that we mainstream Christians today living in the United States are not the first Christians in history to think that sex is a good thing. Be historically informed when you go to make your judgments about Christianity and about people. So he's going to compare, like he typically does, subjectivism and intrinsicism to his own view. The intrinsicist would condemn sex the way that the monastic Catholics did. The subjectivists are going to say, oh yeah, well, it's just your body chemistry and do what you like. It doesn't matter. There's no standards. He does make some comments here that I disagree with. He gets into detail at the bottom of 346 about several things. He includes abortion and other things that I just don't agree with objectivism on abortion. And we have discussions of this on several of our FT&CI videos. And it's really important. It's to the point where objectivists and Christians are on the opposite side of the culture wars for this issue. And this is such a key issue that it makes it so that we have to look at each other and say, you're advocating evil here. And it's very sad because other than that, I respect these guys on a lot of issues. It breaks fellowship from the point of view of the culture war. The fact that Christians understand that abortion is wrong is going to be a key ingredient in our success, because objectivists and the objectivism movement, believing in abortion the way they do, they're never going to win the culture war. Too many people know that that's wicked. So it's like a thorn in their side, and it may be even providence that Christians that believe in some of these philosophically good ideas are going to be able to dominate over objectivists, because we have a more consistent picture. Top of 347, he talks about subjectivism. Within the subjectivist framework, the joy of sex is like the joy of getting drunk or just dissipation. And it's not considered to be a spiritual value. And so this is the common thing, is that the intrinsicists reject the spiritual value of sex, and the subjectivists reject the spiritual value of it. So some men seek to make sex not the expression of self-esteem, but the means of gaining it, usually through the partner's approval or submission. This would be the womanizer. There's a lot of characters in Ayn Rand's novels that can illustrate this point. There's an Ayn Rand play called Ideal that has a character that illustrates this point. That's useful, and I think that's consistent with Christianity to understand it the way that Ayn Rand does. Next page, onto a new topic. We're just summarizing the overall chapter now. The individual who gains these objectivist values does not say, there but for the grace of God go I. He earned what he has, and he knows it. This is the objectivist picture on the sense of efficacy that a person has in his life. And as a Christian, I look at that expression and I just say yes and no. Yes, we would say when I do something that is good, I would say I really did do something that's good and I take joy in that. But I also say, like he quotes here, there but for the grace of God go I when I see sinners. Because I believe I was dead in my sin before God sent the Holy Spirit to regenerate me, to change what I desired, to bring me to life again. That's what I believe as a Christian. So I have to look at other people that have not been regenerated and say, there but for the grace of God. Literally, go I. If you're talking about it in a different sense of the term, when you achieve a moral life, when you love your own life and you achieve values, you are able to say, I'm grateful for the part that my own choices had in this. I'm grateful that I made the choice to marry a good person and to be faithful to her. I'm grateful for the fact that I had kids. These are choices that I made, and I am proud of them. Going on to the next page, and this will be the last page, he talks about this difference between the person who has joy and pride in their own life versus the kind of person who thinks the world is ultimately devoid of values. So he compares objectivism with the philosophy of angst, which means death, nothingness, nausea. The emotional outlook of this whole axis, whether religious or secular, ancient or modern, is captured eloquently in a remark of Schopenhauer, who is an avowed mystic and altruist. Just listen to this. Whatever one may say, Schopenhauer writes, the happiest moment of the happy man is the moment of his falling asleep, and the unhappiest moment of the unhappy, that of his waking. Human life must be some kind of mistake. There is surely a mistake here, but it is not life. Peikoff, with his concise sense of humor. Schopenhauer is wrong. The whole history of German philosophy around Schopenhauer and Kant before him is wrong. And that's really good news for us who want to live on Earth and have a good philosophy. Peikoff writes, a rational philosophy, like a process of virtue, actually works. It is practical. If the thing that one wishes to reach is that which is man's birthright, the gaiety of an innocent, soaring spirit reveling in a benevolent universe. Now, it was man's birthright in the garden. Adam and Eve had that as their birthright, but it was lost. And that's the story that objectivism misses. They miss the gospel. They miss the fact that we were sinners, we need a savior, and that we have one. Jesus Christ, God's Son, came to earth, lived a perfect life, preached. He told us who God was, and he told us what right from wrong were. And he did it in a way that we can understand and that we can follow him. He died on a cross, rose again, and his blood on that cross paid for our sin, for all that would believe in him. That's what the objectivists need to hear, what they need to believe. Sounds like foolishness to them. It is true, and it does have its foundation in what we can observe and what we can know using our own minds. Yes, it is good to desire to live according to your birthright. But we've lost our birthright, objectivists. And objectivists, you need Jesus Christ. That's what's missing here. While the objectivists speak of living in the gaiety of an innocent, soaring spirit, reveling in a benevolent universe, I just ask them, show me. Show me your innocent spirit. Because I know the truth about myself. I know the truth about you, each one of you objectivists. None of us have an innocent spirit. And that's the issue that you'll never get around, even if you make arguments that God doesn't exist. You'll never get around the fact that you know that you don't have an innocent spirit. So you know, written on your own heart, the law of God, and you know that you are a transgressor. Nobody will change that. That's the one area where I can agree with the presuppositionalists, the Vantillians. Why are we beating around the bush here? I'm not going to pretend like you don't know that you're a transgressor. That's where Christians have the high ground in this moral argument. We know the truth, and we know the truth that the objectivists are evading, that atheists and any unbeliever is evading. So that's what is missing. And you combine that truth, the fact that there is a true gospel, you combine what the scripture says with common sense looking at the world and rejecting so many of the false philosophical ideas, and you're going to have Christians that are more capable in the public sphere of moral reasoning and of answering the criticisms that are brought in this age and in whatever scenario in the future. That's what we stand for at ChristianIntellectual.com. We stand for teaching Christians sound moral reasoning on these difficult issues that have been confused by people in and out of the church through the ages. Well, I'm looking forward to future discussions. We've just wrapped up this chapter and we're finished with happiness, and we're going on to chapter 10, government. What are the implications of this entire worldview on what kind of government we should have? Looking forward to future discussions with you. You can find everything at ChristianIntellectual.com/objectivism. And I'll talk to you soon. God bless.